And we are live with the
Hello,
first
everybody.
Fireside Chat since, Hank, I checked while we were chatting. The
Yeah.
first Fireside Chat since August 26th. Yeah,
No way.
that's why it feels like it's been so long, my friend. It's been
It's been
almost
so long.
it's been almost 4 months. 3.5 months.
Jeez.
So,
Wow.
hello, everybody, and welcome to a Fireside Chat where Hank and I are going to be talking about identifying your writing weaknesses and specifically our own weaknesses to kind of spur the conversation.
Yeah.
I see Kara saying hello in the chat there, and as you
Hello,
join in,
Kara.
please say hello, say where you're from. These chats, these fireside chats that we have, are meant to be very casual conversations where Hank and I discuss, but we are more than happy. We are actually looking forward to engagement from
Yeah.
the folks watching.
Yeah.
There's no.
And
Oh, go ahead.
the difference between this show and our craft Q&A office hours is for the craft Q&A office hours, we're prepared. And we we think of questions ahead of time and think of responses that might be helpful. And whereas a fireside chat, we pick a topic and we just come and talk off the top of the spine and
Yeah.
hopefully get down to the realities of the writing life. So it's usually a lot of fun, and there's a certain magic that comes to there's certain magic that comes just from having conversations with friends anyway. But
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree.
we always look
So
forward to what
I want
happens
to
here.
drop some hellos. I said hello to Kara, but Kara, welcome to a lifetime Dabble membership. Hopefully, you'll be able to join me for our workshop tomorrow, for a premium workshop tomorrow.
No.
Matalver, nice to see you. Nephilim, nice to
Yeah.
see you again. Joy and David, hello, hello. Awesome, awesome. I'm
You
glad you could all
you
join in.
are doing a workshop tomorrow. What are you talking about
Yes.
tomorrow?
Tomorrow's Dabble Premium workshop is talking about story structure. We're going to talk about what structure is, some of the different popular kinds, how you use structure in writing, and then how you use structure in revising as well. So it's going to be a cool workshop. I really like structure, and I know it sounds limiting, and I often say it sounds unsexy, but it is important. And if you want to pursue writing seriously, you need to at least have an understanding of structure.
Yeah.
You don't need to explicitly use one or the other, but if you understand it, you just write better stories. That's the simple truth.
Right. And I am we were actually talking about this right before we went live, that I'm in the middle of revising a book right now, and so I'm going to pop in and see if I can't glean some helpful tips from you tomorrow.
For
Should
sure.
be fun.
Absolutely. Emily just asked, how do I find the workshop? I've joined the premium as well. Emily, I will tell you what, I'll send out another email to premium folks. I know folks have joined since then. I'll send it out this afternoon. And you can also check out our premium community over at the Storycraft Cafe. If you are logged into the cafe using your same email that you use for your Dabble account, you'll automatically get added to the premium space, and it's under events there. I will share the link to the Storycraft Cafe, though, in the chat here. Storycraft Cafe, for those who don't know, is a Dabble sponsored / run community for all authors, dabblers and non-dabblers alike. But if you have premium, I suggest you make an account there because you get to chat with other people, and that's where we post premium content.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's a
All
fun
right.
space.
Oh, are you ready, sir?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Let's
Let's
do
do it. I'm brushing off the fireside cobwebs here. All right. So, writing weaknesses. It's fun because it's an alliteration, but in reality, all authors have things that they are good at and things that they're not so good at.
Yeah.
And I think when we participate in something like the 60-day novel challenge or NaNoWriMo, when you write a lot of words in a small amount of time, then it really highlights what your weaknesses might be. So I thought we could take this time to discuss what you and I learned during the last month and what weaknesses we're already aware of, how we might deal with those, how we deal with them personally, and how the other might deal with them. And if you're in the chat with us here and you're aware of one of your writing shortcomings or weaknesses, share if you're comfortable with it, and we can chat about that one too. This is a
Yeah.
very casual conversation. There's no rules here except, the normal don't be a jerk and be nice. But yeah, do
Okay,
you want to
I'll
start?
watch myself.
Yeah.
I'll be good.
Oh no, we don't have to be nice to each other, Hank. That's what the people come for. This gladiatorial
Right.
conversation.
For Sparta.
Do you want to start or do you want to
Yeah,
be?
I think I'll start. I was thinking about this earlier. I do have some things that I actively have to continue to work on. But one thing that I wanted to start with was, um, through my evolution of becoming more of a planner than a pantser, I have been able to address one of my shortcomings, and this is something that I can uh, kind of point to as an area of growth is that I used to be really excited about beginnings and I used to be really excited about endings. And I think I've talked before that I almost always know exactly how my book is going to end. And I get really excited about beginnings because there's usually an air of mystery, and I like to write provocative openings that kind of tantalize and get you to thinking. And then somewhere in the middle, it was the middle to me always felt like just a way to bridge the exciting opening from the uh, glorious ending.
Mhm.
And but the middle was, just kind of a thing that you had to go through. And since I have taken more of a planner approach, I've been able to think through those things ahead of time, look at my story from that kind of 50,000 foot view, and see where the ebbs and the ebbs and flows are, and look where to anticipate weaknesses ahead of time, and address those before the writing begins. So that's kind of a um, thing that I used to struggle with, but through my growth as a writer, that has become something that is easier for me. So we'll start on a positive note. We'll just say that is something that I can point to that that has helped me grow. And yeah, so we'll start there. How about you?
Like in terms of the middle, or
Just
actually let's stay on that. Let's stay on that because
yeah,
we often call it the messy middle or the murky
right,
middle or the muddy middle or whatever M word you want to use.
right,
Um, and it's kind of like a double-edged sword because it can be muddy for the reader and the writer as well. Ideally, not
yeah,
the reader. You want to set up your story in a way that's not hard to get through. But
yeah,
sometimes that's just how it is because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the middle where characters have to go through trying things and then they have to react to them and then they have to grow. And then they go through another trying thing and then they react to it and they grow. And so there are those peaks, but there are also the valleys. And the valleys are super important, but the valleys are the low octane, like take a step back and breathe moments, which
right,
can be tough, at least for me, to write, to be honest, because I live for the high octane stuff.
mm,
I live for all that fun, sword play and magic and whatnot.
yeah.
Uh, but those in between moments, in between the conflict and the tension, those are arguably the most important. So that actually links to one of my weaknesses that I have here, but we'll get to that in a sec.
And
Um,
can I say that if it feels like a slog for the writer, there's a good chance it will feel like a slog for the reader.
yes.
Yeah, if you're not excited to write it, they there's a good chance they won't be excited to read it. Now, I have to qualify that a little bit because sometimes as a writer you get into your own head and it's actually better than you think it is.
Hmm.
Um, but just as a rule of thumb, if it feels wonky to you as the writer, there's a good chance that it will for the reader as well. At least that's something you should take a critical eye to later and make sure that it's not. But that if you're feeling that writing it, there's a good chance they will feel that reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that in itself, to reuse the same comparison, is a double-edged sword because
Yeah.
it might feel worse to you because you've been invested in this story for months,
Right.
if not more. So maybe you're bored of it, or maybe you know the twist that's coming, so you don't have that anticipation. But at the same time, you also know more about the story. So if you know all the background information and you're still hating what you're writing, then that's going to translate to the reader as well, who
Right.
doesn't have all that information and might be confused or might just feel like something's lacking.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a tough one to get through. And so
Yeah.
you more or less overcame that, or at least have mitigated it a bit through
a bit.
more plotting, more
Yeah.
outlining.
Yeah. More
Did you
plotting,
find
more.
even with go
No, go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry. I was just reiterating what you said.
Did you find during November, even with the planning that you did beforehand, was there any of that kind of murkiness going on in the middle?
There really wasn't, because I was so because I'd spent an entire month, well, almost an entire month, because I did switch projects about a week into October,
No.
but almost an entire month I spent on this plan, and I was so ready to get started when November rolled around that I had all this pent up story that just kind of came
Mhm.
out, and I'd been over that outline and over it and over it and over it and over the plot grid, that I was just ready to get started, and it all just kind of poured out. Now, after November, that's a whole other story, as we talked about.
Mhm.
Um, but no, I really didn't have any hesitation through November. It was
Nice.
kind of day in, day out. It just kind of poured out, and I relied heavily on my plan. I knew what I had to write every day when I sat down. Uh, Daily writing sprints also helped, because I would have my morning writing session and get out the bones of that chapter, and then during our writing sprints, I would go through and flesh out those chapters, and you know, I was afforded a lot more time to sit with my story during the day than I
Mhm.
normally am, and, so November is not reality. Let's
Yeah.
just go ahead and address that now. November, for a lot of reasons, whether it's, you're sitting down to write in the midst of a hectic schedule every day, that's not sustainable for most people at the level that we push it in November. But you and I are in a very unique situation where we work for a company where part of our job is writing and encouraging other people to write and to kind of write in front of people, as you know and a lot of people are not in that position, and so, are we fortunate? Yes. Are we thankful for that? Yes. Is it reality?
No.
Not exactly, but
Yeah.
it's fun, and I'm thankful for it. you know
I wanna pivot over to just Mizelle's question real quick,
yeah.
asking if there's gonna be a replay of tomorrow's premium workshop. There will be, using the same link. If you sign up for it,
Yeah.
using the link in the premium email from last week and what I'll send out later today, you will be able to watch it on demand through that link. It'll also go up on YouTube shortly after we have it.
Yeah.
David's saying no 0 days, which is great. And I also encourage folks, if you have encountered the murky middle, share how you got over it or what really bothers you about it in the
Yeah.
chat. But David's saying no 0 days, which is a great way to get through the middle, because if you get overwhelmed by the middle of your story, it's easy to not write, and then you're going to be overwhelmed forever. It's not like you're going to have a spark that's going to let you type 5,000 words a day until you're
Right.
through it. But if you write 10, 50, 100, 200 words every day because you're committing to no 0 days, then you are constantly pushing yourself forward. And it
Yeah.
might be slow, but you'll eventually get through it.
Yeah. And to tack on to what David just said there, no 0 days. If you take the approach, I'm just going to sit down and write a paragraph. That's all I have the mental capacity to do right now. A lot of times, I'm not saying this is every day, but a lot of times, if you sit down to write a paragraph, then a second paragraph is
Hmm.
easier to write, and then maybe a third, and then before you know, you've got a page, and that's
Yeah.
250 words. And if you committed to writing a 40-word paragraph, and now you've got 250 words, that is a solid win for that day, and
Yeah.
you get to chalk that up in the win column.
Yeah. Nephilim has a good piece of advice here. I just keep brainstorming ideas and writing different versions until I come up with something that works, which is interesting. I like that. I've never seen that one before.
Yeah, that's a little bit like my discovery process at the very beginning of a book. A lot of times I'll write a couple of chapters just to get a feel for the characters and
Mhm.
kind of figure out what their motivations are, what's important to them in the world. And if I can determine what's important to them, then I can use that information against them to to find ways to torture my protagonist, and a lot of a lot of that comes from just free writing and just kind of, and I kind of don't count that in my writing process because then I plan out, but there is a lot of just kind of exploring in the beginning that and I'm very much in favor of the brainstorming phase, and you know, so yeah,
Well,
I
and
like that.
something I mentioned before is that when I get bogged down in the middle, instead of just like if my goal is to write 500 words for the day, let's say,
Yeah,
and I've hit 100 words and I just can't figure out what's coming next in the scene, instead of just hitting my head against the wall, I'll jump to a different scene. I'll jump to one that I'm excited about. And you'll have to do a little bit of patching up. You'll have to fix some things in that scene that you jump ahead to. But
yeah,
if you're really struggling with that momentum bit of it, jump around. You don't have to write chronologically or
yeah.
linearly. Um,
And I'm a big fan of using curly braces or the hard
mhm,
brackets and just leaving myself a note. Fill this in later, and maybe a couple of words of what I think is going to happen or what I need to bridge what I'm going to go ahead and write, and come back and fill that in later. Leave yourself some notes, leave a sentence or so
mhm.
of what the bridge needs to be, and move on. Come back to it
Yeah,
when you're more in the brain space for that.
yeah. I want to highlight Logio or Logio. Tell me if it's a hard G or not, please. I think I've
Mhm.
debated this before on stream, not even just in my head on stream. But just keep writing, even if it's stuff you won't use later. Maybe you
Yeah,
work on a backstory that won't go in the book. Then maybe you can see how the murky middle comes together and then tacked on. Sometimes you just have to let the characters lead you and then cut out the stuff that doesn't fit, which I really like.
yeah,
I think
I do
that's
too.
excellent advice.
Yeah,
And that,
and sometimes, it may be a page of fluff that gets cut, but a lot of times what I've discovered is in that page somewhere is a nugget that's worth saving, and a lot of
mhm,
times that is a nugget that will trigger your brain to something else that becomes gold. So just because, sometimes it's just part of the process of thinking through it is just writing out, and the thinking happens in that somewhere. There's probably a psychologist who could untangle that for us, but who
we'll
cares?
get someone in for you.
Yeah,
Saying it's like an H, like Loyo, Lohio. Okay, I'm not going to
okay.
dwell on it because I don't want to. I don't want to make you feel bad. But thank you for clarifying that for me. That so this murky middle talk actually leads me to my first weakness that I want to transition to, and
Okay.
that is procrastination and motivation.
Mm,
Those are things that I tend to really struggle with, and that's why I keep repeating no 0 days and talking about writing habits and building a habit. Because Hank,
yeah.
you and I were chatting before the show about how November was so much fun and we wrote so much, but the post November hangover, for lack of a better word, is real. And I said to you, my goal in November started at 1,600 words, went up to 2,500 at some point. Now
Yeah.
I'm aiming for 400 words a day. And like you said, we are in this kind of privileged position to be able to write with people. We talk about writing all day. We get excited about it. It's what we're really
Yeah.
passionate about. And to say, okay, I'm aiming for a sixth of my goal that I was aiming for 10 days ago, that
Right.
it's a little defeating. But at the same time, if I had kept that goal, if I go too hard for too long, then it ends up feeling like a chore. And
Yeah.
because we have full-time jobs, and writing, I think we're in a similar situation because we each have this collection of books under our belts. Like writing brings in some money, but at times it's like, okay, I need to think about my full-time income first because you got to pay the bills. Writing
Right.
has to wait, and then it's easy to push that off over and over again. So
Yeah.
we
Yeah. The
say
power
no.
company wants me to think about my
Yeah.
my day job a lot. So
How dare they?
how dare they? Yeah.
Which I'm so glad that No 0 Days has taken up such a strong hold
Yeah.
in our community of watchers and writers, because that's like I introduced that in November 1st when we did the Nano workshop. And it just caught on like wildfire, and I've taken it to heart so much since then. Because before that, like, okay, I'm gonna wake up, I'm gonna write Monday to Friday, but I'll take weekends off. Now I can't take a weekend off because people are gonna be mad at me.
Okay.
Say and that
We really need to design a Dabble T-shirt that says
Oh,
"No 0 days" on the
yeah,
back. And we need to
yeah.
bring that up to Jake. We need to make that happen. That needs to happen.
But
No 0
that
days.
leads to, like, I wrote down 2 notes about my own weaknesses here.
Yeah,
And one of them is that the no 0 days has helped, but it's really the community that has helped more. And I've said this so many times over the last month that writing often feels solitary, but in reality, it's not. You have the
yeah,
Storycraft Cafe, you have these events where it's not just us chatting, but people chatting in the comments and the chat itself. All that kind of stuff helps me get through my tendency to procrastinate and my tendency to have ebbs and flows of motivation, which is normal, but like extreme ebbs sometimes.
yeah. Well, let's address that for just a second.
Yeah,
There's this common trope that writers are introverts and they don't like to socialize with other people. I think November completely dashed that meme against the rocks because there was no better place to be than this YouTube channel, the Storycraft Cafe. Our community showed up and lifted everyone else up. It was such an amazing community of folks that came together, and there were no introverts. It was just people talking about their passions, lifting each other up, and it's such
yeah,
a beautiful thing. So, yeah, you know, that's one of those tropes that gets bandied about, but um, you know, I think you just have to find the passion of this community and then people show up.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's super important to work that into your writing as well, whether it's a
Yeah.
hobby or part-time job or a full-time job. You'll also we launched 2 courses for free for everyone to access on the Storycraft Cafe, and one of them is how to revise your nano project or whatever novel you're working on. And a lot of that is talking about the team that you bring into it, the people that you lean on and you ask a favor for, and you do a favor for in return. And that's other writers that you'll find in the Storycraft Cafe, but it's also readers, like beta readers, and people cheering you on as you're going through months of revisions. Like there's a lot of community that's necessary for you to pursue a goal that is very, very large. If you're writing like a 150,000 word novel, doing it by yourself for a year, 2 years, however long it takes, that's dare I say, like, against the human condition. That is not something that we want to do. Uh, so
Yeah.
so yeah. I do, before we move on to your next weakness, I want to tackle some of the
Okay.
ones that are showing up in the chat here, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Uh, I've started a few, but let's go with Matulver saying, I gotta say my biggest weakness is trusting myself. Often I sit and don't know what to write, but as soon as I start writing, then it starts to flow. It's just that murky middle point of starting and trusting it will happen. And so I think Matulver was saying this in regards to the murky middle, but I think this is something that a lot of people face, is that kind of that hurdle where you want to write, but you don't know what you want to write, even if you've planned it. And I think outlining can help in that case. But even if you've planned it, sometimes you just sit there and it's like, okay, what's coming? What's the first word supposed to be? What's the first paragraph supposed to be? You ever encountered that, Hank?
Yes. Yeah. Just yeah, and then the more you think about it, the worse it gets. And yeah, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point.
Well, and it's funny because I don't think this is something that really goes away until a certain point, because like I mentioned before, you and I both have a number of works out there,
Yeah.
and so I have 5 books out there, and I still will sit down and I'll think, okay, what if this is the worst thing ever written, or what if
Yeah.
nobody likes this? And that it's funny because that thought actually never comes up when we're doing writing sprints and the writing's live and people are seeing my first draft as it appears, but I never think about that. It's
The
which
rawest of the first draft.
yeah, the rawest of the writing possible, and that
Yeah.
thought never crosses my mind. But if I'm sitting by myself getting ready to type, sometimes I can think, okay, what if this is just trash? uh to that, I will refine it. That paragraph will probably change. It might
Yeah.
not even make it into the story. So that kind of logical thinking can come in, but is very that emotional thinking makes you doubt yourself sometimes when you go to write.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the, well, not maybe, that is one of the benefits of a NaNoWriMo style challenge, because there's very little time to sit and think uh about, is this any good or not. That's, you just don't have the time to get into that emotional thinking space, and it's
Yeah.
just, I've got to get these words down. And that, for some reason, we're able to turn off in November and say, this is going to change. This is just a first draft. And we can have that kind of talk with ourselves in November, but February, we're like, oh, this is terrible. This is going to be terrible. No, it's the same first draft that you wrote, that you would have written in November. It's just on a different point in the calendar. Just let it be what it's going to be. And, you know,
Yeah.
that's what
And
revisions are for.
Metalver, what I would challenge you to do if you're struggling with this now or, in the near future, intentionally write poorly for 4 sentences. Like,
Yeah.
don't just say, okay, it's okay that it's bad. Like, try and make it bad so that when you flow into your normal writing, like, okay, it could be way worse. And by then you're already reaching that, point where it is flowing and you are feeling confident again. And you can even put like an asterisk, type. Okay. And then when it starts getting better, maybe even backtrack 3 sentences from where you last wrote and write a duplicate that is awful. And then when you go back to revise it, you can put that other asterisk in or delete to the asterisk. So
Yeah.
hey, this was just a warm up writing session.
Yeah. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Make it terrible. To make it as
Yeah.
terrible as you can. I love that. Yeah, that's because, well, surely I can't write that bad on, in my normal voice. So, yeah, I like that. It's pretty great.
uh, Joy here also saying, I feel like I'm giving too much information and then I second guess myself and take it all out. That's interesting. Have you ever experienced that, Hank?
Um, y- yes. And I talked about this a little bit during the Nano Month. One thing that I have started doing in my revising is, instead of erasing and and fixing, I go through uh, and mark out, strike through things that I change, and then um, I'll then type a replacement sentence, or I'll, just strike through a word or two that I feel like's redundant or extra or whatever. And then when I come back later and kind of do another top down read through that chapter, I can see, okay, I didn't erase this. This was my original thought. This was my replacement thought. Now, which one of those was better? And was I thinking, what was my thinking like in replacing that? And having that breadcrumb, that trail to follow there, has been a tremendous help, because sometimes I can say, okay, I see why I struck through this, but there was a nugget there that I just couldn't quite grasp, but I think I know what I was trying to do there. And sometimes I can salvage something from there that, if I just erased it and retyped it, I wouldn't have that to salvage. And that has been a big help uh, for me to leave myself uh, crumbs of my editing. And sometimes I had a great idea, I just didn't execute it well, and but then I would have just lost that idea. So that's been a big help for me, and just one of those little tricks.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, Joy, take like try to get yourself in the mindset that whatever you write now is going to be the worst it's ever going to be. So when I say that, I don't mean, like intentionally write bad every time, like we just
Yeah,
talked about, but you might feel like you are giving out too much information. Don't stress about going back and fixing that right away because that's what we revise for. So
yeah,
try and push ahead. And maybe you do end up giving too much information and you do have to fix it. Or maybe you fix it a couple times and then a beta reader says you've given too much information. That happens. But it might be, if you're identifying this as a weakness right now, then it might be that your brain's exacerbating what the problem actually is. And
yeah,
then you can go and change it. And maybe you're actually making it worse or you're making an unnecessary change and you're just stalling yourself from getting closer and closer to the finish
yeah.
line. So
And
maybe since I'm issuing challenges, for the next 2 weeks, Joy, you're not allowed to go and change anything if you think that there's too much information being given
Yeah.
away.
And sometimes it's not that there's too much information. Maybe you're just using too many words to get this information across. Maybe take the ideas that you said there, but think of a better, more concise, more pithy way to say it. Maybe maybe this paragraph could be a really punchy sentence or two, and that way you get the information across, and it's helpful without the reader just getting lost in it. So you know, that- not to discount what Doug said at all, but sometimes it's you're giving away too much information. Sometimes it's just you're using too many words.
Yeah.
See if you can reduce it, and sometimes it adds more. Excuse me. Sometimes by reducing the amount of words that you say it in, that adds more punch to it, brings more life to the paragraph. I don't know. Give it a try. But if you erase it, then you've lost any chance to get that original thought back. So
No one's ever accused me of using too few words in my writing.
you know.
Received a number of people saying, Doug, you need to be less verbose. To which I say, yes, I do. But also, I'm just a more verbose writer than some, which is fine. It's my style. You don't like it?
Yeah.
Leave a 4-star review instead of 5. Okay. So, Hank, let's go to your next weakness.
Okay. I was going to say one thing that I constantly have to work on is my stories being too narrow, too narrowly focused. I have a tendency to really focus on a character or a two characters interaction, and they're you not getting a wide enough angle on the world and how the things that are going on with these characters affect tertiary characters and things like that. I have a tendency when I write to take a very narrow focus, and I'm constantly having to pull back and add in more texture of the world, add in other characters, and you write more on the epic side, fantasy, and I write very close cropped stories,
Two
and
people in
that's
a truck.
two people in a truck is a perfect example. So I'm constantly having to look at where I can bring in another perspective to this that then enhances what's going on with the two people in the truck. And so that's something that I constantly have to work on, is that I very much want to get into a character's head and really navel gaze,
Mm,
for lack of a better term. And
yeah.
that's just my natural tendency. And that's one thing where I have to put my craft hat on and really show up as a craftsman and not just the artist. Um, and and really work on it. Because that's not where my brain initially goes. So that's something I have to constantly work on.
That's interesting because, so as you know, my November project was a novella
Yeah.
for the series that I'm working on, and so I felt really restrained. And even as a novella, it's over 50,000 words now, and that's longer than a novella that's longer than I want a novella that I'm giving away for free to be.
Right.
Right. But I felt that restraint of it being a lot narrower than I'm used to writing because of how short it is. So as you mentioned, I write fantasy, so my shortest work in my current series is 111,000 words, so twice the length of the novella, and I got to have a couple subplots in it. My current draft of the third book is going up to 160,000 words, and I have 3 major subplots and a couple little ones dancing here and there that can be fleshed out in later books. So I'm used to having all these perspectives and all this world to deal with, and I tell scenes from different perspectives throughout the book. So it's like I have the opposite problem of you in that regard, but I experienced the closeness of just one story for one character during last month.
Yeah.
um, yeah, and it's a tough one, but
It
at the same
is.
time, sometimes the story calls for a more limited perspective. Now, if you identify it as a weakness or something you want to work on, then obviously you want more perspective in your story.
Yeah.
But uh, I don't want people in the chat thinking okay, I should always expand to a big amount of or a large amount of perspectives, right? No,
Yeah.
that's not the case.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that like I'm never going to show up at the keyboard and think of a story with a band of characters where I'm going to have 10 um viewpoint characters. That's never going to happen for me unless um unless
Happens
I'm
to me all the time.
assigned to write that kind of story and then I'll figure it out, but that's not where my natural inclination goes.
Mhm.
Um and the and sometimes there a story calls for like two, two guys stuck in the cab of a truck going on a mystical journey down a dark
Mhm.
highway. Um, that kind of calls for a limited, scope. But what I figured out is, and I figured out this pretty quickly, was that during this long it's basically a long conversation that's happening. There are flashbacks that happen, and then in those flashbacks, the camera pulls way out, and you get to see the whole scope of a portion of someone's life, and other characters come in, other situations come in, and that allows you the breadth of of a full life story, and then you get to come back to the cab of the truck and get to have that narrow focus again for another chapter or two, and then when the tension really mounts up, then you zoom out and you get another one of these flashback scenes, and it really, adds to the feeling of the story breathing. You get this in and out, and it really, what I found is it gives the reader uh a chance to not get bored. There's something else coming. There are more character perspectives come in, and I'm able to tell more about the character without it just being this character mulling something over in their head. You get to see how their actions have affected other characters, and then through the empathy that you have for this other relational situation, that then applies back to the character, and you get th- to show things happening to the character without telling about all of the remorse that's happening. Those things are way more effective. So when you find yourself being constrained naturally in one way of telling the story, finding a different perspective to write from really opens a lot of doors. And that, just giving yourself time to think about that and to anticipate those problems ahead of time will really alleviate a lot of those moments of consternation during the writing.
Oh, good word. Consternation.
Yeah, that's the word for today.
I as you were explaining all that, I had this realization that I think if a lot of people need to take a step back and examine the stakes of their
Yeah,
story,
yeah,
not the delicious meat, but the what's that risk here, right? And because if you are very limited in your perspective of the world, even if you're writing fantasy or not, right?
yeah,
If the stakes are solely about one person, that might work for your story and you're diving really deep into a character driven story. But if it's not enough to make an entire story out of or capture the reader's attention, you need to think about the stakes around them too. How do their actions affect the world, and how does the world affect them? How do they affect other characters? How do other characters affect them? All that stuff. So maybe when you're reviewing your work, if you're someone that has the same sort of issue where the perspective feels too small sometimes, think about the stakes and think about how you can up those stakes to pull back a little bit. Because what you're explaining there, Hank, when you're going through the flashbacks, you get to see how it affects other people. And that's where the stakes get bigger and they get more meaningful than
right,
just one person.
right. Yeah.
Okay, I want to highlight Mazelle's issue here. Issue sounds so coarse, so cruel. A thing they brought up is deciding between all the ways a story can go that stops me. Sometimes I discover my ending doesn't work, or I started in the wrong place. Well, Mizelle, you
Mm,
asked about watching the replay of tomorrow's premium workshop, so I definitely recommend that because that's going to be one of the things that I really drill in on with structure. Because when it comes to a story structure, I'm not just talking about the way the plot moves, so not just going from inciting incident to climax, but how that ties into a character arc at the same time. because when you're thinking about how an ending should work, your ending can change sometimes. That's just a reality of writing. Sometimes that happens. But a satisfying ending resolves the plot and it resolves the character, the protagonist's arc at the same time. And if you can find a way that does both of those, and if you can think ahead about what you want that to look like, then you can start working your way there and put the pieces together so that you don't have to feel stressed about meandering too much.
Do you ever get to the end of your book and it has changed from what you originally anticipated, Doug?
Um, well, generally no, but big caveat.
Yeah.
My book 2 in my series was originally one chapter at the end of my book 1. So so yes,
More
the
than the
ending has
ending changed.
changed. Endings change in a substantial way. And
Yeah.
that was from beta reader feedback. People saying,
Yeah.
this happened too quickly. It deserves its own book. And so lo and behold, I made it its own book. But generally, I have the idea of the ending in mind, and I'm working towards that. I think it was Stephen James talking about how he doesn't have the ending in mind, so he just lets the characters lead him. Great. I can't
That
do
stresses me out so bad.
that.
So bad.
I don't mind that for character arcs for secondary characters, or like subplots. I don't mind that. Like I'm okay exploring that or it changing along the way. But for like my book itself, for the big plot, a big character arc, I need to know how that ends. I need to know where.
Yeah. Yeah. That that blows my mind. That stresses me out so bad when people are like, I have no idea how it's gonna end. I'm just writing to the end and I'm as surprised as everyone else. No, that's that is not a
Thanks.
good time to me as a writer. That would scare me to death.
But it is a
Even
good
my
time for some
even
people.
well, yes, I'm just talking about for me. This is me.
Yes.
Even in my pantser stage, I always knew where I was writing toward. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I always knew where I was going. And the not the writing with 10 feet ahead of you constantly. Oh,
Mhm.
that gives me the worst butterflies. And I love that other people are able to do that, and that's amazing. But yeah.
All right,
And
I'm gonna drop in my second weakness
okay.
here.
Yeah.
And that is, and I mentioned this at the top of the show, but when I'm writing, I favor conflict over characters. And I know that's bad, but let me explain it a little bit. I think the way I explained it before was I like the peaks, the high octane,
Yeah.
exciting action filled stuff, whether that action is fighting or like an argument or whatever. And I struggle in the first draft with the valleys when characters react to what just happened. But
Yeah.
I know from a storycraft perspective, from a professional perspective, those valleys are the most important part of a story. The peaks are just a means to get to the valleys, essentially.
Right. Right.
So I really, when it comes to that, it's, for me at least, the way I've been working at it is it's just practice, 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 and part of that practice involves getting outside feedback.
Yeah.
And I have this one writing friend, and I was showing her some of my work in progress, and I could tell when she was excited over a very character driven chapter that just happened after a sword fight she wasn't particularly excited about because she doesn't love sword fights in books. So I know that I'm starting to get better at that, but it's still something I'm conscious of when I'm writing.
I'm gonna offer a counterpoint to that. A lot of times, I will favor the down times more than the big action sequences, and I just want people to talk it out and just to really hash out those problems, And sometimes you just need to throw in a car explosion somewhere.
Yeah.
It's sometimes that's what motivates people to change. It's not sometimes people don't just talk it out. Sometimes they need some big tragedy to shake them up and to get their attention. So that's really funny that's where I tend to and you tend to go the opposite way. And if we
Opposites.
would just merge together, we would make a perfect writer, I think.
Yeah, I think so. For myself at least, I blame R.A. Salvatore, who I know you know personally,
I do.
but
I do.
he got me into well, not him personally, but his books got me into fantasy when I was younger. And he writes the most meticulous fight scenes, I think, of any author out
Yeah.
there. Like he'll
Yeah.
tell you what angle a wrist was at. He'll tell you how the feet are moving, how the footwork's like. He'll do all of that. And
I'm
so
gonna
that, I
I'm just
love
gonna
it.
text Bob right now and tell him that you said it's all his fault.
You know what? Fine.
That's so funny. Yeah, yeah. He definitely loves to immerse you into the minutia, and from his perspective, he wants you to feel like you're in the control chair,
Yeah.
feeling it all, and he definitely has a way of doing that for sure.
Which, and I'm not saying I'm at the level of Mr. Salvatore, because he is one of the greatest fantasy writers of our time, I would say.
Of
Uh,
Yeah,
but I
hands down.
recently got a review on my first book, and don't read all your reviews, but I do.
Yeah.
Uh, where someone said that they didn't like how much detail I put into fight scenes, especially compared to other elements of the book. And I'm like, okay, that's valid. And I know that it's not for everyone, but also I can't take that to heart and say that I'll never put that much detail into a fight scene again. I take
Right.
that and I say, okay, I need to put more detail into other elements of it, because my style is just focusing on conflict a lot more than some people do.
Yeah. And that's maybe a good point to bring up, that sometimes feedback that you get from readers, especially in the form of reviews, um, sometimes they mean exactly what they say, but sometimes when they say you put too much detail in a fight scene, what they're really saying is that the fight scenes are more prevalent than the times of recovery between those
Yeah.
fight scenes. And maybe if you were to amp that up, it would feel more balanced, and you don't actually need to change your fight scenes at all. You just need to balance somewhere else, that.
Yeah.
So you kind of, that's one of those things where we say don't read your reviews, but we all do. But the proper interpretation of reviews is probably more important than the actual information that you get in reviews. And I know that sounds horrible to say that people don't mean what they say. Of course they mean what they say, but maybe the interpreting of that, in maybe the interpreting it in how you fix the problem, is not so on the nose. Maybe fixing another aspect will make it feel more balanced, and then the starkness of the fight scenes doesn't seem so stark, or
Yeah.
it's taking the information they give you and figuring out what will make it feel more real for the reader, as opposed to just cutting down the fight scenes. Maybe that's one way to solve it. Maybe another, you know, maybe
Not gonna
maybe there's
happen, Hank.
another way to, that's all I'm saying, is that, um, you know, to take the advice that you're given, or the feedback that you're given, and find a way for that to feel that way for the reader, whether it's actually trimming that, or amplifying something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to use that to transition over to something Nephilim said: a real tendency to over rely on dialogue, and it feels like it's all talk and nothing else at times. And that is just almost the same issue in a different package, because dialogue can be action as well. Dialogue, if you're just doing a back and forth all the time, you aren't giving room for physical reactions. You aren't giving room for what you mentioned before, that drawing back and seeing what the bigger picture is.
Right.
So sometimes you're going to have 8 lines of dialogue back to back, and that's okay if it's working within the pacing of the rest of your novel, your scene, your chapter, what have you.
Right. Yeah,
But yeah,
and that's the same problem I have. I tend to go very deep on dialogue, and focusing, and just having to learn how to balance that with other stuff. Yeah, yeah, I feel
yeah.
you. I'm I'm in the same boat as you.
Sometimes you also feel like you're writing too much dialogue too. I remember it's the same
Mhm.
friend I was talking about before. I said to her, "Okay, this feels like I've just have way too much dialogue going on in this scene." She goes, "No, you don't. You just don't. You feel like you do, Doug, but you
Yeah,
don't." And so that outside feedback is, again, very critical to crafting a great story, because you don't know where your issues lie, or what issues you're just making up in your head.
yeah, yeah, and sometimes, I haven't necessarily done this in a while, but something that I used to do, and I found it very helpful, was to when I'd finish a chapter, to scroll through the chapter and look at the bulk of text and see if it was big paragraphs,
Hmm.
or if it was broken up, single dialogue lines. Um, and a lot of times, and I guess I'm just very keen on the visual representation of story, but a lot of times you can look at it and you can tell if this is going to be very dialogue heavy or if it's going to be very exposition heavy. And sometimes just getting a look at that can give you a clue into how it's going to be taken by the reader. And sometimes just varying that in just the way that it looks can have a very profound impact on how it's read.
Yeah.
Just a little
Yeah.
thing I picked up along the way.
Well, absolutely, because books, unless we're talking audiobooks, but books are a visual medium.
Yeah.
And on an e-reader, for example, it will format it for you based on the size of the screen. But if you have a really big paragraph, then your reader's just looking at a phone or a tablet that is just pure lines of text, right? And
Just a
on a
wall of
page,
text.
yeah, on a page, if your paragraph takes up the whole page, that's A, something's gone wrong. So you need to break it up just from a technical perspective. But B, that's tough on the reader. They don't have that visual indicator to break up their pacing, and their
Right.
eyes will start to glaze and they'll start to lose track of which line they're on because there's no way to help them separate it. Like that's really difficult. So that's definitely. I also think, Hank, you might be able to tell me this because you read more, I think, new releases than I do, given that people just send them to you for fun. Um, but I'm finding through my editing experience, there's a tendency towards shorter paragraphs these
Mhm.
days than there used to be, and I think we're becoming less verbose and descriptive in writing because that's just the way that we're moving. But also, I think genres like urban fantasy are gaining a lot of ground, especially like urban romantasy, if you will. And that tends to be faster paced and thus have shorter paragraphs than, say, epic fantasy, which will have longer descriptions because readers are okay with that. But even in epic fantasy, I'm finding shorter paragraphs than there used to be.
Yeah. And it so much is changing about the way we tell stories and the business of publishing. You open a new release and they're short, punchy chapters. You're dropped immediately into the story. This was something I talked to Terry Brooks about a couple of years ago. That he wrote the Shannara series and
Mhm.
was the big epic fantasy author after Tolkien. I mean, when you're talking about big fantasy series authors, he was the guy right after Tolkien. And he said that
For
his
sure.
very first book, The Sword of Shannara, um, it's like 75 pages before anything happens in this book. Nothing happens in
Mm.
75 pages. And he laughed about it. He's like, you could not get away with that today. You would need to fast forward to chapter 7 and just drop the reader directly in the middle of chapter 7 and just hit the ground running. Some of that is just, the taste of the reading populace at any given time. Um, so, there's a certain thing about, um, you being influenced by what you read and all of that you bring with you, and also having one eye toward kind of what's going on now. I'm not
Mhm.
saying to mimic the market and to write directly to market. There's That's a whole other discussion for another time. But you do kind of have to be aware of what people have an appetite for now
Mhm.
and how they read, and that is probably more important than the genre specifics about what's going on in the market at any given time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it will always be unique to an author's voice and style as well. I often
Yeah,
bring up Adam Neville, who's a horror author out of the UK.
yeah.
And he has said in interviews before that he really likes Cormac McCarthy of The
Mm,
Road fame. And Cormac McCarthy is very verbose in his descriptions.
yeah, and
And
also
thus
never met a piece of punctuation that he liked. Yeah,
Yes, I actually remember now that you point that out, I remember reading The Road many years ago and thinking that. Um, but Adam Neville will do the same kind of description, like the
yeah,
same. two paragraphs to describe something that if I were writing, I would not spend the same amount of time on. But
Right.
it works for him and it works for his readers, of which I am one. Even if it doesn't necessarily work for his readers in other genres that they read. If that
Yeah.
happened in an urban fantasy I'm reading, then I would be like, what the heck's going on?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Some of that is just allowing people to develop a love for your voice and that you
Yep.
bring a very specific thing to the genre that no one else can get away with. And
Yeah.
and that's just kind of earning the trust of your readers. And that's a very delicate, balancing act. But, be you, but,
I've
try to,
often thought of that because so 3 of my 5 books out are urban fantasy. I
yeah,
co-authored them, and so they are um, very not standard, not commercial, but like they're urban fantasy that you expect. They have a
yeah,
bit more of a military spin on it because of who I wrote with and the character. But I'm thinking when I go to write my urban fantasy series that's brewing up here, it's
hmm
going to be darker than most urban fantasy. It's going to be a little more gruesome. It's going to have more horror elements because that's who I am as an author, and that's what I bring to whatever I write. So, so yeah, it's but it's a delicate balance at the same time because if I write an urban fantasy that is way too dark and way too verbose at times, then the urban fantasy audience won't like it. And so they won't read it and it won't sell, and then I won't write it ever again. So finding that balance is tough, and I think that that kind of loops back to what the topic of this fireside chat is that weaknesses, like if you're aware of them you can work on them, but
right,
I think also be aware of them insofar as sometimes those weaknesses can't ever be fixed or they don't need to be fixed,
right.
for lack of a better word. Like I will get better at writing characters' reactions to events, but I will always have more fun writing sword fights than I will the reaction to someone dying in a sword fight.
Sure, sure.
And
Yeah,
that's just how it is,
yeah,
Hank.
yeah. Well, and like we said earlier, maybe your sword fights are not the problem at all, but it's what you do between the sword fights that maybe that's where you need to concentrate because you love to write the sword fights. So don't deny yourself what you love to do, or else why are we writing if we're writing
Exactly.
what we hate? But maybe work on the between the sword fights. Maybe then that balances the other out and it feels like a more fulfilling experience for readers.
Yeah.
Or maybe, the guy that doesn't like the sword fights, maybe this is not the genre for him. That wouldn't be the first time that that's happened. So we think we love a genre and then we get in and we're like, I kind of do, but I don't like everything in this genre. Okay, well, go read a Star Wars novel. It's
Yeah.
fine. It's fine. There's plenty of stuff out there to read. We don't have a shortage of books in the world.
No, we absolutely do not. And even within a genre or subgenre, I'm looking at romance now.
Yeah.
There are tropes, so many tropes in
So
romance
many
that
tropes.
readers absolutely love, but someone might love enemies to lovers and hate, one bed kind of,
Yeah.
or whatever that, I forget the exact name of that trope, but you know what I'm talking about.
Forced
So
proximity or
yeah, forced
yeah.
proximity. Yeah. So even within the same genre, or even if it's within the same subgenre, if a trope is or isn't there, that can determine whether a reader likes it or not. So don't
Yeah.
let that dissuade you if you get that kind of critical feedback from an outside source saying, I really didn't like this, but let's say 5 other people who you shared it with really like it. Okay, maybe that's just your style. I mean, that's just who you are as an author.
Yeah. And
Um,
that's okay. It's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw Kate here said, so glad I took a day off," joining us at 8 minutes to the hour, and now we're approaching that hour mark, which is where we tend to cut off these live streams.
Yeah.
So I'm
But
I'm
Kate, this will
sorry.
immediately be available as a replay on YouTube, so you can go back and just watch it from the beginning, and
Yeah.
you know you won't have missed a thing.
And at the risk of extending us past the hour mark now, because we will. Emily just posted this, what I think is a very uh, cool thing we need to talk about. It sounds a
Yeah.
bit like you need to write a lot to know what your unique voice is, then find the genre it works within. And yes and no, I think.
Yeah.
Hank, do you want to say anything before I rant?
I'm just gonna say that, uh, like you said, yes and no. Because there are certain aspects of voice that work better with different tropes.
Mhm.
Maybe identify the tropes that you really like, and then write through a story to kind of feel what your voice is like, and then hone in on. I need to think about this a minute. Go ahead with your rant.
So I think yes, in that if you write a specific way and you find the genre that really likes that specific way, you can do really well, and you'll be very happy. You'll write stories if you like that genre, and your readers will like your writing. But at the same time, I think a well-developed voice can transcend genre and subgenre boundaries. And I think specifically, since we talked about growing trends in writing, there's a growing trend to have like a sarcastic or a snarky narrator,
Yeah,
right? In urban fantasy, that's almost a must. I'm struggling to think of an urban fantasy I've read in the last 5 years that didn't have a character, a main character, with a little bit of sass to them. Uh, then you might think, okay, in epic fantasy, that's not necessarily the case, but we are moving towards there as well, or at least those kinds of characters are successful. And I think Joe Abercrombie for that one, because a lot of his characters, they are just very sassy, they're very sarcastic, they're very crude, and like
yeah,
that. But then there are other people who don't write characters like that. R.A. Salvatore's Dritz series didn't have those kinds of characters. It had maybe
right.
one that was a little sassy, but it was all very serious instead.
Yeah,
So even within the same genres, or spread between different subgenres at times, you'll have the same voices or similar voices. So you can move around, you can find ones that you really love, but there's nothing wrong with writing to a genre that matches the way that you really like to write. Mm. That's what I have to say about that.
yeah, yeah. I don't have anything to disagree with that. Yeah,
As per usual, no,
yeah.
Hank and I disagree with each other all the time. That's what makes these so much fun.
That's right.
But
That's
what
right.
Emily said in here is you need to write a lot to know what your unique voice is, and that's what I think is the most important, regardless of what genre you land in. Write a lot, develop your voice, hone your
Yeah.
skills, and then wherever you write, you will be successful.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed. Write a lot. Period. And you know, and it doesn't matter if you begin by emulating voices that you like, writers that you like, but somewhere along the way, little idiosyncrasies that are part of your character start to bleed through and start to replace things that you admire from other people, and your voice will emerge. And some of that is just from doing the work and just allowing your characters to grow out of your imagination and then
Mhm.
described with, through your voice. And that's where voice comes from.
Yeah. And
But
since we're
there's
talking about weaknesses,
yeah, there's no replacing doing the work. That just always, you just got to do the work. We can we can remove as much friction from the process as we can, but you still have to do the work. That's just part
yeah,
of it.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And because we were talking about weaknesses, the only way you're going to discover where you need to grow and the only way you're going to grow is
Is
by doing. That's
do
just
the
the way
work.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And every new word you write puts you closer to being a stronger author.
Yeah.
So just write.
And,
Always be writing
yeah.
is another thing we always say here.
Yeah. And like we talked about during Nano Month so much, is that right now we're focusing on writing a first draft, and we're not putting all of the expectations on this first draft. That's what editing is for. Well, you
Mhm.
can't edit a blank page, so you've got to write a page to then be able to edit it. And
Yeah.
doing the work over and over again is where you will get to emerge as the writer that you are or will become.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Hank, I think I'm going to
Good
start
chat.
wrapping this up here, but I will
Yeah.
use a moment to just shamelessly plug some stuff.
Yeah.
First, I am dropping in the chat the link to the Storycraft Cafe again. There you'll find a community of writers, dabblers, and non-dabblers alike to get along with, support, ask advice from, and all of that. But you'll also find our two new courses that we launched at the end of November. One, finally finish your first draft. That will help you get in the mindset and develop the habits to finish your first draft. And the other is what to do with a nano draft, which is where you'll go through and make an entire revision plan to get you from first draft to something ready for publication. So I strongly encourage you to go there. I also will say for the premium folks watching us, we do have our workshop on tomorrow using story structure. I will send out another email again this afternoon to get you the link for that if you've joined in the last week and didn't get the last premium newsletter. But hopefully I get to see you there. And then, Hank, there's an interview happening on Wednesday after our writing sprints. Do you want
Yes,
to?
John Bredesen, who is a longtime dabbler, and who I got to meet in person at Author. What's the Author Nation? Thank you, in Vegas last month when Jacob and I went out to. We got to have dinner with John. Fantastic guy. He has a really interesting and unique story where he worked in IT for decades and retired to become a writer. And so he has kind of focused on his writing as a second career after retiring and being a hobbyist writer, while juggling a day job. Fascinating story, fascinating guy. We're going to have a lot of fun chatting. So that'll be Wednesday at standard podcast time or 2 p.m. Eastern.
Awesome.
Yeah. So join us.
Kate's saying, every word we write makes us a stronger author is lovely. That is lovely. You know what? We'll make a t-shirt for that one too. Let's make t-shirts and t-shirts.
Yes. 2025 is the year of the t-shirt.
Of the t-shirt. Well, Hank, thank you for joining me for this fireside chat. Our first since August and our last of the year. And thank you everyone for joining us for this. This was a good time. I love these casual, chill conversations. It's much refreshing. All right. Yeah. Well, hopefully we will see everyone in the events this week. Other than that, happy writing, and we'll see you later.
Happy writing, guys.